Hello, it's Alister McGrath again, continuing this short series of presentations on C.S. Lewis. Now, I think for most of C.S. Lewis's readers, his greatest achievement is the Chronicles of Narnia. And that's what we're beginning to look at in this presentation. The 7 Chronicles of Narnia were published during the period 1950 to 1956. And the best known of them is the opening novel in the series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And this introduces us to the land of Narnia, to the noble lion Aslan, and to the 4 Pevensey children, Edmund, Lucy, Peter, and Susan. And the discovery of Narnia has become one of the best known scenes in children's literature. The children were evacuated from London at the start of the Second World War to escape the threat of bombing of England's capital city. And they ended up living in an old house in the English countryside, which was owned and occupied by a slightly eccentric professor. And many wonder, is this Lewis offering a caricature of himself? On a particularly wet and miserable day when they can't get outside to play, the children decide to explore the house itself. And as they do so, they finally stumble into a room that Lewis tells us was quite empty, except for one big wardrobe. And as everyone knows, that wardrobe turns out to be the door into Narnia. Now, given the massive impact of Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, I think it's important to appreciate they were conceived when Lewis's personal life had hit an all-time low. In the late 1940s, Lewis's world was falling to pieces. Life was bleak. England faced austerity measures, including food rationing, as a result of the aftermath of the Second World War. And tensions were building up within the senior common room at Magdalen College over the future direction of the college. And the Faculty of English were also divided over its post-war direction. And Lewis began to realize that he was isolated. He was passed over for at least 2 major senior academic appointments at Oxford because his colleagues felt he was concentrating too much on popular works and neglecting his academic responsibilities. Lewis began to realize he didn't fit in at Oxford anymore. And as if that wasn't enough, his personal life was something of a mess. For example, his brother Warnie, who lived with Lewis at the Kilns in Headington, was becoming difficult. He was an alcoholic, and Lewis found it difficult to look after him. In addition, Lewis was massively overworked due to a rapid rise in student numbers as a result of the end of the Second World War. His friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien was also beginning to break down. Everything was going wrong. And yet, in the midst of what seemed to be a hopeless personal situation, the magical world of Narnia was born. So was writing Narnia some kind of consolation or perhaps even form of escapism for Lewis? Was Lewis using this imagined world as a way of distracting himself from the bleak situation he now faced professionally and personally? And clearly we can't rule out these possibilities. But I think it's much more likely that Lewis saw Narnia as an exploration of the way in which a good story helps us to explore theological ideas. Lewis wants his readers to understand we live in a world that is shaped by stories, by narratives, which tell us who we are, why we're here, and what really matters. And the question is, which of these stories can we trust? One of the dominant narratives of Western culture goes like this. We are here by accident, the meaningless products of a random process. We can only invent meaning and purpose in life and do our best to stay alive. There is no point to life. Now we find this narrative in writers like Richard Dawkins. They're very influential, but are they right? And should we trust those who tell us this story? Because there is another story which takes a very different approach, and it goes like this. We are precious creatures of a loving God who has created us to do something special that maybe only we can do. We have the privilege of being able to do something good and useful for God in this world, and we need to work out what it is. Now, of course, This is a story we find in the Bible, and it's echoed in great Christian writers down the ages, including, of course, Lewis himself. Now, these two stories are very different, and they're not compatible. They can't both be right. So which do we choose? Which do we trust? And one of Lewis's greatest achievements is to help us realize we live in a world of competing narratives. In the end, we have to decide which one we're going to trust. And having made that decision, we then need to enter into and inhabit that trusted story. So let's think about the moment when the four children enter the world of Narnia in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And they're told different stories about this mysterious land of Narnia. But which is right? Is Narnia really the realm of the White Witch? Or is Narnia really the realm of the mysterious lion Aslan, whose return is expected at any time? Which story do you trust? And gradually the children begin to realize it's the story of Aslan. Every individual story about Narnia turns out to be part of this bigger story. And Lewis gradually discloses this bigger picture in the Narnia series. It's a grand narrative of interlocking stories that make sense of the riddles the children see and experience around them. It helps the children to understand their experience of Narnia with a new clarity and depth, like a camera lens bringing the landscape of Narnia into sharp focus. But here's the point. It helps them to see where they fit into the story of Narnia. Each of their stories is part of this bigger story, which they can help to move along. Now, to some, the stories of Narnia are childish nonsense, but to others, they are completely transformative. These evocative stories show it's possible for the weak and the foolish to have a noble calling in a dark and confusing world. That our deepest intuitions point us to the true meaning of things, that there is indeed something beautiful and wonderful at the heart of our universe, and this can be found, embraced, and adored. One of the great themes of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is that there is a master ring that rules every other ring. But when this ring is found, it has to be destroyed because it's so dangerous and destructive. But Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia are about finding a master story that makes sense of all other stories, then embracing the story because of its power to give meaning and value to life. At the core of the Chronicles of Narnia is Lewis's imaginative retelling of the Christian big story, the grand narrative of creation, redemption, and final consummation. A good and beautiful creation is spoiled and ruined by a fall, and the Creator then enters into the creation to restore things through a redemptive sacrifice. Yet even after the coming of the Redeemer, the struggle against evil and sin has to continue, and it won't end until the final restoration and transformation of all things. Yet, as Lewis makes very clear throughout the Chronicles of Narnia, the story of Aslan is not something we simply hear about. We're invited to enter this story, to become part of it. And Lewis wants us to realize our own story is given meaning, direction, and purpose by the greater story of God. Let's try to unpack that point. Each of us has our own unique story, and Lewis is clear that individual story really matters, but it needs to be brought into connection with this big story that gives our own story a new importance and significance. We realize we're an important part of something bigger. Our own story is framed by this greater story that gives us value and purpose. And in one sense, faith is about embracing this bigger story and allowing our own story to become part of it. Lewis's remarkable achievement in the Chronicles of Narnia is to allow his readers to inhabit this big story, to get inside it and feel what it's like to be part of it. Mere Christianity may help us to understand Christian ideas, but the stories of Narnia allow us to step inside and experience the Christian story and judge it by its ability to make sense of things and chime in with our deepest intuitions about truth, beauty and goodness. Now, the central character of the Chronicles of Narnia is Aslan. And in the next presentation, we're going to focus on Aslan in more detail and ask how Lewis's narrative helps us to appreciate the role and place of Christ in the way we understand reality and live within it. So I look forward to speaking to you again very soon, and thank you for listening to me thus far.